She lived in the heart of Rome, but died almost in anonymity. She refused marriage, power, and comfort, all because of a vow. A simple vow that placed her among the martyrs of Christianity. They called her the daughter of Saint Peter. She was buried beside the apostles, and for centuries, kings knelt before her tomb. But today, almost no one remembers her. Saint Petronilla is one of those forgotten stories, a quiet flame that burned brightly in the early church, and now, perhaps, only needs to be remembered to warm hearts once again. In this video, you'll discover who she was, what made her so special, why France adopted her as its patroness, and why she can still intercede for you, especially in moments of weakness, pain, and illness. A silent young woman, healed by a miracle, faithful unto death, and buried in the most sacred place in the church. This is the journey of Saint Petronilla. Chapter 1. The young woman who chose death over breaking a vow. Petronilla, a name you've probably never heard in a Sunday homily or read in the most popular books about saints. And yet, her story was one of the most revered in the early church. And it all began with a choice that, for many, would seem unthinkable. She was young, very young. She lived in Rome, possibly belonging to one of the oldest Christian families in the city. She had everything to be admired: beauty, youth, social prestige. But it was precisely what she did with all of that that made her unforgettable. Petronilla chose total dedication to God. She made a vow of perpetual virginity. And in the first century, that was profoundly radical. In a society where marriage was nearly an obligation, especially for noble women, saying no to marriage meant saying yes to a path of misunderstanding and even persecution. But she wasn't alone. The early Christian community was full of men and women who chose the gospel even when it meant going against the current. Petronilla was one of those resolute souls. Her vow wasn't just a devotional act. It was a silent cry of inner freedom, a direct response to the love of Christ. Then came Flaccus, a powerful man, wealthy, influential, from a noble family. He was used to getting whatever he wanted, and he wanted Petronilla. Her beauty captivated him. Her silence challenged him. When he discovered she had taken a vow, he thought it was just a phase, a youthful idea, a fleeting religious whim. He believed he could make her change her mind. He made a marriage proposal, lavishly, with promises, with persistence. But she refused. Flaccus didn't take her no as final. He wasn't used to rejection. So he gave her an ultimatum: 3 days. 3 days to think. 3 days to prepare for marriage. If she didn't accept, he would take her by force. She had until the 3rd day to decide. Petronilla returned to her room. She didn't panic. She didn't run. Instead, she fasted. She prayed constantly. She begged God to deliver her from a fate that would violate her consecration. She knew what Flaccus was capable of, and she knew her vow wasn't just a promise. It was her identity. During those 3 days, her only concern was remaining faithful. She had no armies, no allies, only her faith. And with that faith, she faced the threat, radically, completely, and with finality. On the 3rd day, she departed. She died peacefully, according to tradition, as if God had called her before evil could reach her. When Flaccus came to take her, he found a funeral procession. Petronilla was already gone, and word quickly spread among the Christians. She had died rather than betray her commitment to Christ. Her death wasn't a public spectacle. No blood was shed in the square, but it was a martyrdom of the purest kind. Interior, spiritual, And that kind of testimony was deeply admired by the early church. Many believed that to die while remaining faithful, even without outward violence, was still martyrdom. A martyrdom of conscience, a martyrdom of fidelity. Little by little, her name began to be remembered with reverence. Inscriptions in the Roman catacombs began calling her Petronilla Martyr. She was buried alongside the early martyrs of the faith, and her tomb became a place of prayer and pilgrimage. What began as a personal tragedy became a collective inspiration. And perhaps the most impressive thing of all is that her story survived, even though it's not found in the Gospels, even though no grand miracles were recorded, even without a detailed biography. Her life was passed down, from voice to voice, from generation to generation, etched in stone, painted in frescoes, carried in the heart of the church, because what Petronilla lived cannot be forgotten and must never be silenced. If stories like this speak to your heart, subscribe to Catholic Journey. Here, we bring forgotten names back to life, hidden courage, sanctity the world tried to erase. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this young woman, who lived in silence, was buried at the very heart of the Vatican. Chapter 2. The Daughter of Saint Peter. For centuries, Christians referred to Petronilla as the daughter of Saint Peter, and not in a symbolic or poetic way, but as if it were literally true. On tomb inscriptions, in ancient prayers, and throughout medieval texts, she was presented as the daughter of the Prince of the Apostles. It's hard to ignore the weight of that title. After all, Peter was the first pope, the leader chosen directly by Christ. To have his own daughter buried among the martyrs of Rome would be something remarkable. But was it true? The Bible doesn't say that Peter had children. We know he was married. The Gospels mention his mother-in-law, but there's no reference to sons or daughters. And none of the apostolic writings suggest it either. So how did the tradition that Petronilla was his daughter spread so widely throughout Christendom? The answer may lie in something deeply spiritual and symbolic. In the early church, the person who baptized you was often regarded as your spiritual father or mother. Baptism was seen as a true rebirth. And if Peter had baptized Petronilla, guided her in the faith, even healed her, it made sense to call her his daughter. Here's an interesting detail. According to an old Roman tradition, Petronilla suffered from paralysis. She couldn't walk. She was a fragile young woman, weighed down by illness, until Peter prayed for her. He laid his hands on her, and she was healed. A simple miracle, quiet, humble, but one that changed everything. From that day on, she followed Peter's teachings, lived as his disciple, learned, served, grew, as someone reborn, not of flesh, but of faith. And so it was only natural for early Christians to recognize her as Peter's daughter, not by blood, but by soul. A daughter born of the Spirit, not of the flesh. There's another curious detail that strengthened this association. Her name, Petronilla, clearly a feminine form of Petrus, Peter. Names carried immense weight in those days. They spoke of identity and mission. People saw it as a sign. The connection between the two wasn't just spiritual. It was etched in her name, in her witness, and in the memory of the faithful. Over time, this connection took deeper root. Religious art began to depict Petronilla alongside Peter. Liturgical texts referred to her as his daughter naturally. And as the centuries passed, the belief that she was Peter's biological daughter became widespread and accepted by many. Today, the Church acknowledges that this is unlikely, but at the same time, it treasures the beauty of their spiritual bond. After all, one doesn't need to be a biological child to inherit the faith. And Petronilla lived as someone who truly carried Peter's legacy, his courage, his fidelity, his total surrender to Christ. This kind of spiritual filiation is a lesson for all of us. Many want to belong to the church, but forget that we must allow ourselves to be formed by her. Petronilla teaches us that discipleship begins with listening, with healing, with transformation. She was healed by Peter, and from that moment on, she became a new woman. And as we'll see, the bond between her and the apostle would shape not only how she was remembered, but where she would be buried, and who would come to call her their patron saint. Chapter 3. The Patroness of Kings? Petronilla, the young woman who lived in silence and died for her faith, could never have imagined that, centuries later, her name would echo through the halls of royal palaces. But that's exactly what happened. Her story, which began in the shadows of the catacombs, became a symbol of alliance between heaven and crown. And the nation that adopted her was one of the most influential in Christian history, France. It all began in the 8th century. Europe was undergoing a period of tension and political reorganization. The Roman Empire had fallen, Germanic tribes had spread across the continent, and the Church was seeking strong allies to preserve Christian values in a fragmented world. It was during this time that Charlemagne and his dynasty, the Frankish kings, rose to prominence, and with them, a historic alliance with the papacy was born. To solidify this bond, the kings of France began referring to themselves as adopted sons of Saint Peter. It was a symbolic title, yes, but one filled with spiritual and political weight. And if they were sons of Peter, then Petronilla, known as the daughter of Saint Peter, became, in a sense, the spiritual sister of France. This connection quickly transformed into devotion. Petronilla was adopted as the patroness of the French monarchy. Her image was venerated in royal ceremonies, in solemn masses, and in processions. Altars dedicated to her appeared in churches throughout France and in chapels inside the Vatican itself. She became, officially, a spiritual bridge between Rome and the French throne. But more than a political symbol, she was seen as a guardian of pure and incorruptible faith. While kings bore the weight of power, she represented the weight of fidelity. While thrones might rise and fall, Petronilla reminded the nobility that there is a kind of royalty that never fades. Holiness. Her chapel inside the Vatican became known as the Chapel of the French Kings. There, nobles of the French court came to pray. Masses were celebrated in her honor. Some members of the aristocracy were even buried there, near her relics. Just the idea of being close to Petronilla brought comfort, as if her presence could intercede, protect, and inspire. For a long time, her name was deeply tied to the spiritual identity of France. In a world torn by wars, where kingdoms rose and fell and the church sought stability, Petronilla stood out. Not because she was a queen, but because she was faithful. Not because she led armies, but because she triumphed through prayer and silence. And here's something beautiful. The royalty of heaven isn't earned with swords or golden crowns. It's earned through surrender. Petronilla was called the most beloved daughter by those who cared for her relics. But for France, she was more than a daughter. She was a model of invisible fidelity, the kind of faith that endures even far from the spotlight. Perhaps that's why, even as time passed, her influence never completely vanished. In times of crisis, in the midst of war, or during plague and despair, her name was still invoked, not just as a martyr, but as the intercessor of an entire nation. And if you love stories like this, of saints who may not appear in textbooks, but whose lives quietly changed the world, I invite you to explore our ebook, 50 Saints, Stories and Prayers for Divine Intervention. In it, you'll find Petronilla's story and many others, saints who were almost forgotten, yet still have so much to teach. You'll find the link below this video. So now, when we hear the title Patroness of Kings, it no longer sounds exaggerated. Because in the kingdom of God, the true royalty belongs to those who become servants. And Petronilla understood that from the very beginning. Chapter 4. Healed by a Miracle. Patron Saint against Fever. Before she was a martyr, before she was called the daughter of Saint Peter, and long before she became the patroness of France, Petronilla was a sick young woman, and that part of her story is rarely told, but it carries a deep meaning, because it was in the weakness of her body that her spiritual greatness began. The oldest traditions say that Petronilla suffered from paralysis, perhaps from birth, or maybe from early childhood. Either way, she was unable to walk, and in those times, physical disability often meant exclusion. People with visible impairments were seen as unfit, sometimes even forgotten by society and religion. But with Petronilla, it was different. Her faith was greater than her limitation, and that drew the attention of a man who was transforming lives wherever he went, Saint Peter. The apostle, leader of the early church, was said to have been moved by her condition. He went to her, not with speeches, not with promises, but with prayer. Simple, direct her, full of faith. He laid his hands upon her. He prayed. And according to the oldest accounts, Petronilla stood up, as if an invisible force had restored her body. As if that paralysis, which had kept her bound to the ground, was broken by the same faith that moved the apostles. From that moment on, her life changed completely. It wasn't just a physical healing, it was a spiritual rebirth. Petronilla began following Peter. She lived as his disciple. She immersed herself deeply in the Christian faith. And that's why many say she wasn't just a biological daughter, but a daughter of faith, born of the Spirit, through healing and the apostles' witness. But that miracle was not forgotten. It became the foundation of a popular devotion that would grow around Petronilla for centuries. The faithful began to invoke her especially in one kind of suffering, fever. Maybe because, like paralysis, fever weakens silently. It consumes slowly. It makes the body tremble, collapse, and give up. But for many, Petronilla became a sign of hope. They prayed to her during fevers, during outbreaks of disease, in moments when medicine had no answers, and reports of healing began to spread. Not spectacular ones, but the kind that happen in the quiet of a home, in a mother's touch, in a child's breath, in a sick person's whispered prayer. In ancient churches, there are records of simple prayers directed to her. Saint Petronilla, who was healed by the Apostle Peter, intercede for us and heal this fever. It was a devotion passed down through generations, as if saying, if she overcame pain, so can I. And so, Petronilla became known as the patron saint against fevers, a silent intercessor for those who suffer in the body, a friend to the weak, a voice before God for those who tremble, not out of fear, but out of pain. The beauty lies in realizing how God writes holiness through stories the world would ignore. A sick girl, forgotten in the corner of a Roman house, became a sign of healing for centuries, because she was faithful, because she trusted, because she believed that weakness is not the end, but the beginning of real strength. And maybe that's why her name is still whispered today, in hospital corridors, beside quiet beds, in the soft prayers spoken between tears and hope. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Martyr? For centuries, the name of Petronilla was spoken with reverence. She was remembered in the catacombs, honored during Mass, invoked in times of fever, and called the spiritual sister of Christian France. But over time, her story began to fade from collective memory. And that reveals something profound. Even the greatest saints, if not remembered with love, can disappear from the world's altars. During the liturgical reform of the 1960s, the Church updated its official calendar of feasts and solemnities. The goal was to simplify the liturgical year and focus on celebrations with strong historical and universal foundations. As a result, the memory of many locally venerated saints was transferred to a list reserved for optional or regional observances. Among them was Saint Petronilla. Before the Reform, May 31st was her feast day. Afterward, the date was reassigned to the visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Although the Roman martyrology still mentions her on that day, many parishes and modern missals no longer include her name. For most Catholics today, she has vanished. She became a silent saint, hidden, forgotten among so many other venerable names. But has she truly been forgotten? Her body still rests in the Vatican. Her bones were transferred with honor in the 8th century to St. Peter's Basilica, and her epitaph, Filiae Dulcissimae, can still be read. The sweetest daughter, daughter of Peter, daughter of the Church, buried beside the apostles, honored by popes, celebrated by kings. That contradiction says a lot about how we live our faith today. We look for famous names, saints with social media presence, saints quoted thousands of times, but we forget those who became great through hidden fidelity. Petronilla never needed a stage. She was a martyr without blood, a queen without a crown, an example without fame. And maybe for that very reason, she is more needed than ever. In a world where everything is fast and disposable, her life stands as a challenge. She reminds us that holiness is a decision, that purity is resistance, that dying to the world is an act of love, and that being forgotten by men doesn't mean being forgotten by God. That's why, even if the world has silenced her, we choose to speak her name. Because there's value in remembering the forgotten. There is beauty in restoring what has been cast aside. And there is grace in diving into the lives of those who remained faithful to the very end, even without applause. Saint Petronilla is still an intercessor, still a model, still living proof that the least in this world will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And if you've made it this far listening to her story, know this, that too is a kind of devotion. Because giving attention to the forgotten is itself an act of love. And that's how holiness is reborn, when someone cares enough to remember. Saint Petronilla never preached to crowds. She never founded convents. She never wrote great theological works. She lived in silence. She chose obscurity. And she died peacefully, to remain faithful to God until the very end. And yet, her life echoed through the centuries, like a soft note that resists time, a small flame that never goes out. She reminds us that faithfulness is worth more than recognition, that there is power in purity, that dying to the world might be the most direct path to eternity. Petronilla didn't become a saint because she did a lot. She became a saint because she loved deeply, because she chose God's will, even when it meant giving up her own life. And maybe, right now, as you hear these words, she's interceding for you, because heaven doesn't forget those who walk against the tide. and the saints never stop walking beside those who listen with faith. If her story touched your heart, if it lit a spark within you, do something simple, like this video, and leave a comment with the words, Saint Petronilla, pray for us. Then share this with someone who needs to remember that holiness also lives in the quiet ones, in the hidden, in the faithful at heart. Thank you for being here. May Saint Petronilla intercede for you, and may your life, even in its struggles, be an offering of faithful love, just like hers.